Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Tammy Kim, and I'm a contributing writer at the New Yorker magazine. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to be in conversation with a close friend of mine, Adam Shatz. Adam is the US editor at the London Review of Books and a professor at Bard College who has written for all of the great publications in the country and the world. You may have heard him on the London Review of Books podcast and on his own interview podcast, which I highly recommend, called Myself with Others. Adam is my go-to expert and a very sensitive expositor on so many topics, including jazz, Black literature, and the Middle East. Last year, he published a wonderful collection of essays called Writers and Missionaries. And of course, today we are here to celebrate his new book, A Lyrical Biography of Frantz Fanon. Many of us in the audience will know Fanon from maybe classroom reading, a chapter or two from The Wretched of the Earth, or Black Skin, White Masks, perhaps. We might have heard stray quotes or excerpts of Fanon invoked at political meetings or protests, especially now. But it wasn't until my conversations with Adam and now his book that I got to know another or many other versions of Fanon. As Adam writes in his introduction, it is striking how many masks Fanon assumed in his short lifetime: soldier and doctor, poet and ideologue, dismantler of myths and creator of myths. Adam is really, I think, the first person who's kind of made all of these versions of Fanon legible to a general public, and for that, I'm extremely grateful. We are going to structure tonight by me starting out with some questions for Adam. After that, we'll open it up to the audience. So please submit your questions on the lower right hand of your screen through the YouTube chat function. Welcome, Adam. So nice to see you.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you so much for that really generous introduction.
Adam, I thought you could start just by saying a little bit about the title of the book, The Rebels Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon. Obviously, he was in psychiatry, which is what the Rebels Clinic refers to, but why emphasize that part of him in the title of the book?
I called it the Rebels Clinic because I wanted to emphasize what Fanon's daily practice actually was. It was as a psychiatrist for the most part, although of course he went on to become a spokesman in an anti-colonial movement and in a people's revolution, a writer. But his principal activity was as a psychiatrist. It was working with people who were mentally ill, who were suffering. And my argument is that it was in the clinic, it was in the hospital that Fanon's thinking about power, about politics, about racialization, about alienation, about things like violence. It was in the clinic that his thinking about these matters really took shape. And I call it the Rebels Clinic because I want to underscore the rebellious or dissident dimension of his thinking. At a certain point in his life, when Fanon becomes an official spokesman of Algeria's national liberation movement, the FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, at that point, Fanon has to step into the role of a revolutionary bureaucrat, serving an organization, reflecting its aims, echoing its statements, parroting some of its rationalizations. And I think that there's a tension in Fanon's life between his rebellious character and his decision to join this movement and to be the good soldier, which, in a sense, he always had been since the time he became a soldier in de Gaulle's army to liberate France from Nazism. Now, the second part of the title is also important. It's lives, plural. It's not life, because Fanon led a very short life. I mean, he died when he was 36 years old of leukemia in, of all places, the United States, a place he called the country of lynchers. But in that short life, he took part in numerous intellectual and political insurgencies. He was involved in the Free French Forces against fascism as a very young man, against Vichy, against fascism. He participated in a psychiatric revolution that was launched in France during the Second World War by radical psychiatrists. He became one of them just after the war. And then he became involved in both the Algerian struggle and in various African movements to decolonize and liberate their countries. And so I wanted to emphasize just the plurality of this short life, because Fanon is so often cast in a role that I think reduces the richness of his work, of his experience, and flattens the contradictions in his writing.
Just to stay on the point of psychiatry for a moment, you have such wonderful and vivid descriptions of his practice in various settings. I'm thinking about the St. Alban Asylum in rural France. I'm thinking about a brief tenure in his home country, Martinique, and then also his service of patients in Tunisia. When you talk about this sort of break with traditional psychiatry and a move toward radical psychiatry, can you just locate us in terms of what was going on discipline-wise for psychiatrists at that time and how he departed from that?
Sure. Fanon was one of many people in psychiatry and also in psychoanalysis, which was something that interested him, although he never undertook an analysis and more or less flirted with the profession. So there were many people in psychiatry in the 1940s who were exploring new ideas about the impact of politics and oppression on people's psyches, looking beyond a narrow model based on either the brain in psychiatry or in psychoanalysis, the bourgeois nuclear family. And Fanon gravitated towards that when he was a medical student in Paris. He started, in Lyon rather. And he became aware of the Saint Alban Clinic at that time because he was reading journals like Esprit, which was a radical Catholic journal that was publishing these innovative papers on what Paul Balvet, French psychiatrist, called the human value of madness. These were psychiatrists who were influenced by Marxism. They were influenced by surrealism. They saw something of value in the wildness of the unconscious. They thought it was a source of potential knowledge. Some of them celebrated irrational experience. Fanon did not, for his own reasons. But this movement really grew out of the wartime resistance. At Saint Alban, you had a group of psychiatrists who were very deft in their strategies and were able to protect the population of mentally ill people, so-called alienated, in the asylum, and to prevent any one of them from dying during the Second World War, which was a remarkable achievement because during the Second World War, between 40 and 50,000 mentally ill people died in psychiatric asylums. It was called the soft extermination, l'extermination douce. And Saint Alban stood out as an exception, and it also gave a sanctuary to rebel fighters, to poets like Paul Éluard, who was a communist poet, to the historian of science, Georges Canguilhem, who wrote the book The Normal and the Pathological. And so Fanon was excited about what he heard about Saint Alban, and as soon as he finished his medical studies in Lyon and published his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, he went to this asylum and forged a very close relationship with a radical psychiatrist from Catalonia who had organized the psychiatric services of the POUM, the Trotskyist anarchist militia during the Spanish Civil War, a man named François Tosquelles. And Tosquelles became his mentor, and eventually he moved beyond Tosquelles.
Wow. In each of your sentences, there's so much to unpack. It's such a rich and sort of intimidating life that he led. I'm wondering if we could just back up a little bit and talk about the Martinican Fanon. Can you say a little bit about his childhood, sort of how he conceived of himself as a West Indian, what it meant to be a West Indian engaged in anti-colonial struggle? Another part of that I think is really interesting in the book is his influence under Aimé Césaire. Fanon was also an aspiring poet, an aspiring playwright. So
Sure.
situate us in that sort of literary and political environment.
Fanon had a very ambivalent relationship to his homeland, to Martinique. He was born in 1925 in Fort-de-France, in the capital of Martinique. His father was a customs inspector. His mother had a shop. They were middle class. They even had servants. They were able to give their children piano lessons. And when he was 15 years old, Vichy took power in France when France fell to the Nazis, and soon after Vichy came to Martinique. It was called the Temps Robert, the time of Robert, because the admirable Robert, a pro-Vichy admiral, had taken over the island. Now, Fanon grew up thinking of himself really as a French person. His parents were Martinicans of color, West Indian Antillais, Antillians of color. For them, black people, and the term they used was les nègres, were Africans. And Fanon saw Africans when he was a child because some of the soldiers stationed in Martinique were African riflemen. They were called Senegalese shooters, the tirailleurs sénégalais. And at one point, his father actually invited a couple of African riflemen to dinner, and Fanon looked at them with a mixture of fascination and fear. They were exotic to him. They wore tarbushes. They wore unusual outfits. And so he didn't have this consciousness of himself as being black in the way that they were black. It was only really when he became a soldier and joined the Free French Forces that he began to experience a progressive disillusionment with the ideals of French republicanism, the idea that France was this liberating, colorblind country of which he was an equal citizen. It first began to happen when he was in Morocco with the Free French Forces, and he discovered that while the African soldiers and Arab soldiers were discriminated against, he was treated as an honorary toubab, an honorary Frenchman. Then, at the end of the war, he couldn't get a French woman to dance with him. They preferred to dance with whites or even with Americans, but certainly not with a black Frenchman. And then he had what was probably his most shattering experience, and it furnishes the primal scene in Black Skin, White Masks, where he was in a train, probably in Paris, because Lyon didn't have a functioning metro system at the time, and a little white boy with his mother, stared at him and said, "Look, maman, un nègre." And he's looking at him with fear. And Fanon suddenly realizes that for this boy, he was like a cannibal. He was like an African cannibal. All these negative associations were connected to him. And he had this crushing realization that he was this racial other in the eyes of this boy. And that inaugurated this disillusionment with the promises that France had made to him. Now, at the same time, Fanon is reading the works of the Negritude movement. And the Negritude movement had three founders. There were many people who were involved in Negritude, but the three most significant founders were Aimé Césaire, a Martinican poet and eventually a statesman, Léopold Senghor, a Senegalese poet, also a statesman. The word has power in these contexts. And Léon Gontran Damas, who was a Guadeloupan and a very brilliant bohemian poet whose voice I hear in Fanon's mature writing. And Fanon had a flirtation with Senghor's writing because Senghor projected this sort of mystical essence of Africanness, and because of his wounding experience in that train and in the army, the idea of this essential black civilization was extraordinarily powerful to him at the time. But ultimately, he embraces the negritude of Aimé Césaire, which is more about self-invention and creation. It's very anti-essentialist. And in 1946, he helped to elect Aimé Césaire as mayor. He came to know Césaire. Césaire was best known for his poem, A Notebook of Return to the Native Land, which was a kind of epic poem about the foundation of the West Indies, depicting slavery as a kind of laboratory of modernity. And Aimé Césaire, as a communist politician, communist member of parliament in France, presided over the departmentalization of Martinique. Martinique ceased to be a colony and became a department. This was something that Fanon originally supported, but later on came to resent and oppose. Césaire also wrote this extraordinary text in the early 1950s. He actually started to compose it in the late 40s, but the definitive edition was published in the early 50s, called The Discourse on Colonialism. The Discourse on Colonialism developed this argument that, in fact, colonialism decivilized the colonist, the colonizer. Colonizer who was claiming to civilize the quote-unquote natives, in fact, was decivilized. Colonialism gave free rein to all of the barbarous and brutal instincts of the colonizer. And this is an argument that Fanon also takes up in The Wretched of the Earth. So the West Indian poetic tradition has this galvanizing impact on Fanon. He models himself on Césaire. He begins to write negritude-like poetry. It's not as good as Césaire's. He was a better prose writer, but there's no question that Césaire left a deep imprint on him. Eventually, Fanon starts to write plays, and he writes 3 plays in the late 1940s, 2 of which survive. But the strange thing about those plays is that there are only the most enigmatic and cryptic references to race, whereas Césaire was known for valorizing the term nègre, which had been a very contentious, often a very offensive term. Aimé Césaire said, "No, we are nègre," and praised it. This was he was essentially doing to nègre what, let's say, the queer movement would later do with queer, right, which had also been an epithet. But Fanon, when he wrote those plays, was not quite ready to affirm his blackness. That came with Black Skin, White Masks.
Thanks so much for that. I definitely want to get into some of the race stuff in a bit. I'm wondering, though, if you could say a little bit about his process of sort of becoming an Algerian and joining this resistance, joining another people's revolution. There's so many moments in the book where you think about somebody like Victor Serge or other sort of figures who made these incredible sacrifices for a cause that wasn't theirs by birth. So why Algeria? What did that represent for him? And talk a little bit about kind of his interaction with, ordinary Algerian people as well, because I know that was a big part of his life.
Sure. Well, Fanon arrives in Algeria in December 1953, and the revolt breaks out 11 months later, November 1st, 1954, All Saints' Day. Fanon is the director of a psychiatric hospital, the Blida-Joinville Psychiatric Hospital. So essentially, he has the position of a colonial administrator. He's raising he starts to raise a family. He comes with his wife. They have a child 2 years later. And about half of his patients are Muslim men, and the other half are European women. And Fanon became, very interested in the Algerians, as soon as he got there. And in effect, he had already developed a fascination with the Algerian experience when he was in Lyon, because he had worked with North African laborers, and he had published a remarkable paper on their psychosomatic illness, which had been described by French doctors as the North African syndrome. The French doctors were essentially dismissing their symptoms and suggesting that these workers just were lazy, that they were coming up with excuses not to show up at the factory. And Fanon argued that, in fact, it was racism, segregation, and despair that had made them ill. And that was part of the argument that he would later develop in Black Skin, White Masks, published in 1952, that racism is a kind of sickness. So he gets to Algeria already with this consciousness about the Algerian colonial question. The editor of his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, Francis Janson, was himself someone who had spent time in colonial Algeria and had predicted that a revolt would break out. So he was exposed to these arguments to some degree. And when he gets to Algeria, he starts to explore Algerian life, and he starts to experiment with new techniques of therapy to reintroduce his Muslim patients to a sense of the joy and potential of everyday life. When he found them, they were in the most parlous condition. Many of them were listless, unshaven, wandering around the hospital grounds, looking hopeless. And Fanon began to introduce things like a café more, a cafe where Muslim men would get together and drink and talk. He brought an Arab Andalusian orchestra to the asylum. He gave them tools so that they could farm, since many of them had been farmers, and this was fiercely resisted by some of the people at the hospital because they were afraid that the Algerians would use these tools to become violent. So he was having pretty intense interactions with his patients, and then he began to step outside the walls of the asylum and to go to parts of the countryside, the so-called bled, the outback, particularly in the Berber area called Kabylia, and to observe indigenous ways of healing the sick. He was particularly interested in the way that they dealt with mentally ill people, and he thought that their methods were much more forgiving than European ones, because for people in Kabylia, it was the jinn, it was the genie who was blamed for mental illness. It wasn't the individual sufferer, whereas European doctors tended to be much more judgmental of patients. So he was, in a sense, kind of falling in love with the Algerians. And there's another reason I think that can't be ignored, which is that the Algerians that he met didn't wear the mask. The shame, the ambivalence and shame that he had about Martinique came from two sources. The first was that the Martinicans had never led a major slave revolt, unlike in Haiti, and so he felt that Martinique had essentially accepted a passive freedom that was really no freedom at all. And the second reason was that he felt that Martinicans had aspired to whiteness, had aspired to assimilate what he called the supremacy of white values. They aspired to Frenchness. This is what he had aspired to. This is what his parents had. And the Algerians, by contrast, refused to assimilate. They stayed very close to their religion, to their identity. Very few of them took up the meager offers of citizenship that the French had put forward, because a condition of their becoming citizens was that they renounced their statute statute under Islamic law. They did not want that. They held themselves apart from the colonizer. And I think that really attracted Fanon. He found people who had no interest in being European.
I'm wondering if you could maybe read a short section.
By the way, there was a bit.
Go ahead.
I want to emphasize that this was also a somewhat romantic perception of the Algerians, because in fact there was a substantial Algerian middle class which had become fluent in French, which had aspired to French citizenship, and which was also nationalist. And in fact, many of the people who found the FLN are French speaking or Francophone. So I just want to emphasize that Fanon's perception of Algerians was in part, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was a hallucination, but it was highly imaginative in some ways. Sure, I'll read something about his work in the village.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could give us a sense of those interactions with sort of ordinary people, with the sort of romance disclaimer. But
sure, I'll read the passage. Fanon was especially intrigued by the role played by Algerian women in the villages he visited. At first glance, he noted in a paper written with two of his interns, they seemed like captives of an implacable rural patriarchy, members of what he called a closed society that remains in the shadow of men who alone are permitted to participate in a truly public society. Yet he realized that women also represented, quote, the world, the others, the unknown, since the destiny of a woman in a traditional society was to marry into another person's family. Her situation is ambiguous. On the one hand, she is subordinate, he wrote, and on the other, She's someone who causes a man's power to fail. Algerian patriarchy was inherently fragile because women had recourse to traditional magic to render their husbands impotent if they were suspected of philandering. Impotence was an especially serious problem in a society in which, quote, all deficits of virile potency are experienced as a major personality disorder, as if the man rendered impotent had been targeted in his essential attribute. A Kabyle man afflicted with impotence did not go to a Western doctor. Rather, he consulted a marabout, or a talib, a traditional healer versed in the Quran. Fanon and his co-authors described a number of the cures based on the writings of the medieval scholar Jalal ad-Din el-Suyuti, consuming a mixture of Indian spices, ginger, pepper, cloves, ingesting the penis of a fox or a wild donkey for a period of 7 days, rubbing the genitals with oil from a vase inscribed with Kabbalistic verses. The Talib, Fanon and his interns wrote, combats magical sorcery by a sort of counter magic. On the one hand, he seeks to replace the sex by a member of an animal that serves as a product of substitution. On the other, he responds to magical formulas by incantatory formulas. Life in the Douars demonstrated the enduring power and resilience of Algerian tradition under colonialism. Far from producing a harmonious mixture of European and Muslim cultures, Fanon observed, the French presence had led to their, quote, simple coexistence, the Muslim citizen often remaining at the margins of Western civilization. To spend time in rural Algeria was to see that it would never be France. Although he did not predict a revolt, he became increasingly aware of the national awakening that his editor, Francis Janson, had discerned in his report in Esprit. He could hear in it the short, acute, and repeated modulations of Muslim women at Blida, the town where he was working, as they applauded a visiting orchestra performing Arab Andalusian music. Then I'll move on a little bit. In one of his most arresting papers, co-written with Raymond Lacaton, another of his colleagues at Blida-Joinville, Fanon reflected on why Algerian criminals refused to confess, even after overwhelming evidence of their guilt was presented. In a 1938 essay, Antoine Porot was the dean of French Algerian psychiatry, and he was a total racist and believed in the biological inferiority of Algerians. Porot had blamed this refusal on the tenacious and insurmountable obstinacy of Algerian Muslims. This primitivism, that's his word, was not, he claimed, the result of a lack of maturity, but of something far more deep-seated, an inability to distinguish between truth and lies. Fanon and Lacaton rejected the racist assumptions of this theory, pointing instead to the defiance behind the refusal to confess and what, in a nod to the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, they called the lived experience of the act. In French law, the aveu, the confession, is not only a signed declaration of guilt, it is also a moral recognition of wrongdoing. The aveu is, and this is a quote, a way of initiating a reintegration within the social group. But in a colonial society, there can be no reintegration if there has been no integration. If Algerian criminals do not, quote, feel bound by a social contract, it is because they do not belong to the social group represented by France. They belong to a subjugated nation. And, it's important to note that Algerians were living under this oppressive fiction that their country, Algeria, was not Algeria, it was France. Algeria had been colonized in 1830. Over 4 decades, the various revolts would be subdued, would be repressed very violently. And in 1848, France divided Algeria into 3 administrative departments of France. So in effect, Algeria was ruled as a part of the administrative territory of France itself. And that would be, the claim of French politicians when the insurgency broke out in November 1954, this can't be a war, because France cannot be at war with itself.
Right. Thank you for that. A thing I was thinking about in terms of this relationship, you talk about his sort of take on Algeria, the Algeria that he dreams up, this kind of romantic notion. But he's also someone who, as you noted at the top of the talk, who at different points was also a bureaucrat for, this sort of insurgency. And I think there's one section I was thinking of where you sort of describe him. His principal role in that moment was to represent the movement, to give public expression to its goals, especially for foreigners. The power he acquired as a spokesman would flatter his ambition and nourish his pride. Later, it would burnish his legend. I was curious if you could say a little bit about how this man who was, was such a critical thinker and also a poet and sort of an artist, was able to kind of play also this spokesperson role, the role of this movement, and how well he functioned within that bureaucracy. He also didn't speak Arabic. He was Black, he was a foreigner, and yet he was able to slot into this.
He was. And, I think I failed in, when I was answering your previous question, I failed to emphasize that the principal reason that Fanon embraced the Algerian struggle is not that he, had developed this attachment to the Algerian people, although I think that was also a motivating dimension. The principal reason is that he regarded the Algerian struggle as a struggle that was not only a national struggle, but was also a universal struggle for freedom, human rights, and dignity. And, Fanon, wanted to join that struggle as soon as it broke out. He actually wanted to become a soldier in it. I mean, he, after all, had fought in World War II. He'd won a croix de guerre. He'd been wounded, and but the Algerians had other uses for him. They asked him eventually to create this clandestine clinic and to work with wounded rebels and to provide them with sanctuary and care. The movement, I think, became very interested in Fanon by the time he was expelled from Algeria at the end of 1956. This was at a time when many people in the movement in Algeria were forced to leave, including the person who became his mentor, his kind of rabbi in the movement, you might say, Aban Ramdan, a great leader from Kabylia and the architect of the interior struggle of the FLN. Most of these people were forced to leave during the Battle of Algiers because the French were carrying out extremely brutal repression of the rebellion, and if they had stayed, they would have found themselves behind bars or killed or guillotined. And Fanon first resigned from his position at the Blida-Joinville hospital, and eventually he gets to Tunisia. And I think that Fanon is seen by the FLN as a man of he's seen really as a very talented spokesman who also has connections with France. And the FLN, one of the FLN's ambitions, and it was a tactical ambition and strategic one as well, was to sow divisions within France. To attract support from at least a section of the French population for the rebellion, and to also sow frustration and exasperation on the part of other French people, to see that it was not in France's interest to hold on to Algeria, even if the majority of the settler population inside Algeria wanted Algeria to remain France. And so someone of Fanon's skills, couldn't be ignored. He had the ability to speak to French leftists, French intellectuals, and eventually they saw that he had an even greater potential to communicate the FLN's aims to what was then called Afrique Noire, Black Africa. And this is why Fanon gets reposted in Accra as the FLN's traveling ambassador, and begins to go to various African capitals. He's in Mali, he's in Guinea, he meets with Sékou Touré, he's eventually in the Congo with Patrice Lumumba, whom he had met at a conference in Accra in 1958. And I think, we shouldn't ignore the fact that Fanon was also personally ambitious. I mean, he was a person who could be very, very humble when he was with people who were mentally ill, people who were suffering, when he was with fighters whom he regarded very highly. But he was also vain. He was also someone who styled himself as a leader, which he wasn't really. He was not a leader. He did not make decisions for the Algerian movement. That simply was not possible. He was an admired and influential foreign sympathizer. He could never quite become Algerian, and yet he does begin to talk about himself as an Algerian, to write about Algerians in the royal we. He starts to do that in his articles for the FLN newspaper El Mujahid. He does it also in his first book on Algeria, which was published in 1959. It was called Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, published in English as A Dying Colonialism, which is a work of kind of engaged sociology. And he does it whenever he's speaking on the FLN's behalf in places like Accra. And he believed it fiercely. And what's more, he believed that in struggle, Algeria was forging a new kind of nationalism, a nationalism of the will to which anyone could belong so long as they supported independence. And, we have to remember that the people who recruited Fanon to the FLN originally were not Algerian Muslims. They were French Catholics. There was a left-wing French Catholic movement that Fanon had first become acquainted with when he lived in France, that had gathered around the journal Esprit, a precociously anti-colonial journal. And in 1948, one of the great contributors to Esprit, the classicist André Mandouze, moved to Algeria, and a circle formed around Mandouze. Mandouze was a radical anti-colonialist. The French despised him. And one of his pupils was a doctor named Pierre Chollet. And Pierre Chollet was from a settler family. They had arrived in Algeria in the 1830s, but Pierre Chollet had seen the poverty and suffering of Algerians, and he'd become a convert to the Algerian cause and an early member of the FLN. He would eventually raise his son in independent Algeria. He died in Algeria, and he was with Fanon in Tunis. And so Fanon had some reason to think of Algeria as potentially producing this new universalist, democratic, multi-ethnic nationalism. The reality, of course, is that there were different currents with the FLN, and this was not the majority current. Fanon's current did not prevail, but he had his reasons for believing in it. It was not entirely utopian.
Let's talk a little bit about the sort of brass tacks of this incredible body of work that he produced in his very short lifetime. You have a great chapter in the book called Fanon's Tape Recorder. And in this chapter, you're kind of talking about some of the conditions of labor and reproductive labor that are undergirding, this is of course my interpretation, that are undergirding his writings. And you mentioned, for instance, his interns earlier. Of one of his most famous and prized interns, I take it, is Alice Turkey, who later became his biographer. There was his wife Josie, who was taking care of the home and the reproduction in the home. And then of course there was Marie Jeanne, right? Manuelin.
Marie Jeanne. No, I was going to say that Alice
about
Turkey,
Josie.
Josie was also a writer, though. She was active professionally.
So so I'd love to just hear about that. I mean, this is both my way of talking about kind of the labor conditions of his work, but also the women behind Fanon. Who were they, and what were they doing, in relation to him?
There's no question that Fanon was regrettably a man of his time. He had insurgent ideas about the struggle against colonialism and racism, and his ideas about gender were not insurgent. They weren't. And I think we have to, own up to that. I don't think we should find excuses. I don't think we should gloss over it, just as I don't think we should gloss over his homophobia, for example. There are lines in Black Skin, White Masks which are very obviously homophobic. At one point he remarks that the idea that a man could be attracted to another man, he finds personally repellent. He at one point writes in that book that the Martinican men, the West Indian men who dress as women and sell their bodies, are doing so for economic reasons, and that in their everyday lives they have apparently very normal sexual lives, as in heteronormative lives. So, later on, Fanon psychoanalyzes one of his only analyses, really, but he psychoanalyzes a gay man in Tunisia, and according to Alice Cherki, he developed much more, enlightened views about homosexuality that did not reduce it to a pathology. When it came to women, his ideas were a bit contradictory because in his everyday life, it's true, in his professional life, he relied on women as facilitators, and as, as you were suggesting, as exploited labor. He never wrote his books. He dictated his books. Black Skin, White Masks was dictated to Josie, and I do not believe Josie was paid for that work. His later books were dictated to his secretary, Marie-Jeanne Manoilon, who's a French woman, a remarkable left-wing French woman, who began to work for him in Tunis. She had been a communist. She'd broken with the Communist Party, along with her husband, who was a Tunisian Armenian engineer at the time of the 1956 Khrushchev revelations, and they'd found another cause to believe in. In a sense, the anti-colonial rebellions replaced the Soviet bloc for each of them. At first, Marie-Jeanne Manoilon didn't particularly like Fanon. She referred to him as the sadist. She was working for him, but he treated her with disdain, a kind of haughtiness, until he noticed that another man, another doctor, appeared to be curious about her, at which point Fanon began to take an interest. And but a real relationship developed between Fanon and Marie-Jeanne Manoilon. We don't know whether or not it ever became amorous, and I have a chapter about that, but it was certainly a relationship of real confidence. And he encouraged her. I mean, in her work and in her career, for example, he introduced her to psychoanalytic ideas at a time when she was still influenced by Marxist, or I should say communist, suspicion of psychoanalysis as a bourgeois science. And a whole world opened up for Marie-Jeanne, and eventually she studied psychoanalysis. She became a social worker after the War of Independence. So he clearly didn't think that women were destined for a life as homemakers. I mean, he offered similar advice to the American radical Elaine Klein, later Elaine Klein Moktefi, when he met her in Accra, and she said that her greatest desire was to just have a man she could lean her head against. And he said, no, don't do that. Follow your own projects. So he definitely believed that his ideas about what he called disalienation, that's a fundamental concept for Fanon. It's the route to freedom. He certainly believed that disalienation applied equally to women and to men. But he was all too willing to rely on women for labor. And at one point, he remarked to a friend of his, rather a colleague, the doctor Michel Martini, that he couldn't abide the idea that his wife would not regard him as anything but a god. So, Fanon was a sexist. There's no question. He was. Now, there's another aspect, though, of Fanon's writings that I think offers itself to, or certainly offered itself to women in struggle. And that was the chapter that he wrote called Algeria Unveiled in A Dying Colonialism. And this was a chapter about Algerian Muslim women who take off the veil and enter the European city, which they typically had not really walked in unaccompanied, pretended to be European women, and either handed arms to male fighters or laid bombs themselves in places like the milk bar. Now, some of those images will probably be familiar to a lot of people listening to this conversation because Gillo Pontecorvo staged them or restaged them in the Battle of Algiers. Fanon was writing about things that had happened in the early stages of the Battle of Algiers, when, in response to the bombing in the Kasbah by members of shadowy French groups linked to the security services, the so-called Rue de Thèbes bombing, in which more than 70 Algerians died. In response to that, the Algerians sent out people to carry out a number of attacks in central Algiers, and the only way that they could get people out beyond the checkpoints was to send women, and the women disguised themselves. And so Fanon wrote this account of how women not only liberated themselves from colonialism by unveiling themselves, but liberated themselves from patriarchy, from their own patriarchy, and acquired this new sense of their own power, a new sense of their bodies. And it's quite an inspired essay. It's misleading in some ways because, well, for one thing, his prediction did not turn out to be true. After the war, as let's say, as in the United States after the Second World War, women were forced to go back to their homes. They were not liberated, and they had to form their own feminist organizations and fight for their rights for years against some of the most draconian laws in the books on inheritance rights, on marriage, and so forth. Again, Fanon was a bit of a dreamer. But he certainly captured what you might call the phenomenological experience of some of these women when they decided to join the revolutionary movement. And there were Algerian women who, after the war, referred to Fanon's writings and said, no, actually, this did describe what it was like for us to become involved in the FLN as fighters.
Mm. Thanks for that. And thank you to the audience for the questions that you guys have submitted so far. Please keep them coming. Adam will go into more speed rounds now so that we can try to fit in as much conversation and Q&A as possible. I wanted to ask one last one myself, which does overlap with some queries from the audience, which is, of course, about Palestine, which is impossible not to talk about right now. I was struck by a section in which you talk about the way that certain Arabic translations of Fanon's work was received and sort of metabolized by the anti-Zionist resistance. You write that the Arabic translations of Fanon's last work helped shape the ideology of the emerging Palestinian resistance to Israel. In his 1981 memoir, My Home, My Land, the Palestine Liberation Organization leader Abu Ayad writes that Fanon, one of his favorite authors, taught him that, quote, only a people who doesn't fear the guns and tanks of the enemy is capable of fighting the revolution to the finish. Of course, this also suggests a topic that always comes up with Fanon, which is what was his real view of armed resistance and violence. So I'm curious if you could talk about that in the context of sort of early anti-Zionist movements. What did Palestine mean to Fanon, and what did Fanon mean to the Palestinians?
Well, the first question is easy. It didn't mean anything because Fanon never wrote about Palestine. There are two or three references to Israel in his writings, mostly in reference to the whole question of post-war reparations. But he did not address the Palestinian question, and I mean, certainly he would have if he had survived. But remember, he died in 1961, and not many people on the French left at that time, aside from the Oriental scholar Jacques Berck or Maxime Rodinson, were even aware of Palestine. And if Fanon was aware of Palestine, and he might have been through his Algerian context, because the Algerians were very aware of Palestine, he never wrote about it. But Palestine, Fanon was very important certainly for some leaders of the Palestinian struggle. Abu Iyad, Salah Khalaf, who was one of the founders of Fatah, and was arguably second in command to Yasser Arafat. Later, he was assassinated by Israel in Tunis, and he was an important strategist for the PLO. Was a very attentive reader of Fanon, and in a sense, one of the early acts of armed resistance by the Palestinians in Jordan in 1968 was a kind of classically Fanonian act. It was the so-called Battle of Karameh, when a group of PLO fighters defended this town of Karameh against an assault by the Israeli army. They were vastly outnumbered, but they fought very valiantly. And Karameh created a kind of myth, and the myth of the Battle of Caramay led to the recruitment of thousands of soldiers. Now, the battle was lost, but the psychological gains were immense. And so, although I think we have to approach with a certain amount of care Fanon's arguments about the therapeutic or psychiatric benefits of becoming involved in an armed struggle, or for that matter, inflicting violence, there's no question that when people, I mean, and this was Fanon's argument, I think, is essentially when people fight back, it does restore some of their self-esteem, their taste of power, their sense that they are not passive victims. And Yasser Arafat in 1968, after the Battle of Caramay, remarked that Palestinians had gone from being downtrodden refugees to brave fighters. That's, I mean, whether or not he read Fanon, it's an idea that Fanon certainly could have identified with. Now, later on, Fanon becomes important to members of the Palestinian left, to groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the first led by George Habash, the second by Nayef Hawatmeh, both Marxists, both Christians, actually. And then in the late 1970s, Fanon starts to become a very important point of reference for the Palestinian American literary critic Edward Said. The work Orientalism, which was published in 1978, a year before the Iranian Revolution, was in many ways informed by Fanon's thinking, not so much about violence, but about the divisions between the colonial world and the colonized world and the colonial world. His ideas about the Eurocentric, the oppression of Eurocentrism. And Said would go on to write extensively about Fanon in his book Culture and Imperialism, and in other works, including The World, the Text, and the Critic. Fanon, in a sense, becomes, I think, as important to Said as thinkers like Foucault and Gramsci had been, and in some ways more important. He was important to him, to Said, not just for his arguments about anti-colonial struggle, but for his arguments about the creation of a national culture, and also his critique of the native bourgeoisie, what he called the national bourgeoisie, the elite of an anti-colonial movement that could become predatorial, could align itself with oppressive external actors. And I think that Said wrote with these arguments in mind when he broke with the PLO in 1994 over the Oslo Accords. And also, I think it's worth mentioning too that there are contemporary Palestinian psychiatrists like Sama Jaber who have attempted to apply Fanon's ideas about any number of things, including the whole question of the effects of colonial warfare on the psyche of the colonized, which is the last chapter of The Wretched of the Earth.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to take some audience questions and scoot us through these quickly so we can squeeze everybody's in. Something I didn't ask up top that came from the audience, just briefly, what inspired you to write this book, to take this on? Obviously, there is an existing Fanon literature, so what were you hoping to add to that?
My interest in Fanon goes back to really being a teenager and seeing his books in their original Grove Press editions in my father's library. And seeing that the image of him on the jacket, and looking very grave, and he was very nattily dressed and kind of brooding, mm-hmm. And I was just fascinated. I wanted to know who this guy was, and I read the book jacket description of this West Indian doctor who had joined this liberation movement all the way in North Africa, and that sparked my curiosity. Even though I was not reading Fanon at the time, I was a teenage leftist involved in struggles over America's involvement in the wars in Central America, the support for the death squads in Nicaragua, and in El Salvador, and for the Contras in Nicaragua, and also the anti-apartheid struggle. And so Fanon fit into that framework. And then when I began to read him in college, in French, actually, in a French class, I was just struck by the First of all, both the visceral and the analytic nature of his writing. His writing was powerful and very distinctive. And at the same time, the way that it connected to various streams of thought that I found exciting: existentialism, psychiatry, negritude, even to some extent surrealism. And then later, when I became a reporter and I was working in places like Palestine and Algeria, I saw the ways in which Fanon's work continued to reverberate, and reverberated in very different ways. And so this was a thinker whose work was, to some extent, dismissed and even made light of, within kind of consensual mainstream liberal culture. Oh, he's just this radical pamphleteer whose books are sold on. But if you went to places like Algeria and Palestine, no, the work was still a living document. It still had meaning. And I felt when I read those biographies, and I actually reviewed David Macy's very fine, very thorough, very meticulous biography in 2001. I found I reviewed that for the Times actually. I found that those books, while being extremely useful, didn't capture really the drama, the intellectual and political drama of Fanon's life. They didn't convey what I'm calling the tragic passion of his life. They didn't foreground some of the tensions in his work and the tensions between his work as a psychiatrist, as a healer, and his work as a militant, as an advocate of armed struggle, or the tensions between his Fanon the rebel and Fanon the revolutionary. And I felt that Fanon's story as a man had not really. And I was lucky because I knew people who knew Fanon. I had started to interview them in 2001 when I first talked to Alice Cherki, the psychoanalyst in Paris who had been his intern in Tunis, and when I spoke to Mohammed Harbi, the great Algerian historian who had clashed with Fanon in Tunis. They disagreed over things like the revolutionary nature of the peasantry. Fanon was a believer, Mohammed Harbi was not. They disagreed over a whole number of things, and Harbi continued to argue with Fanon in his own very brilliant work. So through these contacts, through these people who had known Fanon and had such strong feelings about him, I thought, I can write something that's a bit different. I can write something that is a portrait of Fanon, but also a portrait of a whole generation of people who aimed to carry out the project of decolonization, but who also wanted to put something better in its place. And I think the latter aspect is sometimes forgotten today.
While we're on the subject of you reading him in the original French, we have a question about the translations of Fanon. So one part of that is, do we have all of his work now in English, or are there portions that remain untranslated? I know, Adam, that because you're fluent in French, you did some of your own translation for some of the quotes in the book. Another part of this is, how do we interpret kind of the way that certain people who were interacting with him in French were sort of presenting his work to an international public? So Jean-Paul Sartre writing the introduction, right? Are there any issues with the way that he framed Fanon?
Sure.
And what is kind of like the lasting impact of that? So both the language and then kind of this framing question.
Well, first of all, I think it's worth saying that however misleading some of the translations. Well, let me talk about some of the problems in the translations. First of all, almost all the work is available now, and thanks in part to the scholars Jean Calfa, who's a French scholar, actually a French Algerian scholar, and Robert Young, who brought into translation Fanon's psychiatric writings, and also many of the other writings that had not been published, that were only available in archives like EMEC, which is an archive in Normandy that I visited, and where I read some of these things in their original form. But they put together this remarkable book called Writings on Freedom and Alienation. And I think if you want to acquire a deeper sense of Fanon and a more complex sense of Fanon, you have to read this book. It doesn't contradict the other writings, but it shows you a different aspect of Fanon's personality as a thinker and above all as a medical practitioner. Now, some of the early translations were quite misleading, translations into English. I'll give you one example. the central chapter of Black Skin, White Mask, the chapter in which he writes about this incident in the train that occurred when he was in France, when he first got to France. The title of that central chapter in French is L'expérience vécue du noir, the lived experience of the black man. This was translated into English originally as the fact of blackness. Now, Fanon actually didn't believe in a fact of blackness. He was an early and radical critic of what the historian Barbara Jean Fields has called racecraft. He did not believe in the existence of races. And although he certainly believed that there was a specific experience, an inescapable experience in a white-dominated society of being black, of being a member of a racialized, oppressed minority, he did not believe in blackness as such. He certainly did never refer to the fact of blackness, and he was a critic of the negritude movement. Above all, the negritude of Léopold Senghor, who had these mystical ideas about blackness, which Fanon ridicules in Black Skin, White Masks when he describes his earlier self as having waded in the irrational and as having imagined that he had unique poetical powers because he was black. So that's one respect in which there has been, I think, a problem with the translations. Another is the way that Fanon uses, and he's very specific about it, uses terms like noir, black, and nègre. And sometimes nègre is mistranslated as black in English translations, perhaps because of this notion that the term nègre is an insulting term, which it is not always. It's a term that has a shifting meaning. Sometimes it can be used as an epithet, and certainly today you would not use the word nègre, but in his own time it had different meanings. When Aimé Césaire spoke of nègre, he was using it actually in a very positive way. When others used it, it was neutral, and in still other usages, it was an epithet similar to the N-word in English. And so Fanon would also at times capitalize black or capitalize nègre. Sometimes he would capitalize white. These capitalizations, which give you the sense that he's writing about not real people, but about racial archetypes, often that capitalization is simply ignored in the English. So Fanon is quite fastidious. Even though he's dictating, he is fastidious, he's careful with his words, and I think, unfortunately, some of the translations are not really alive to that. And another thing that the translations have often ignored is the specific philosophical terminology that he uses. Often Fanon is making use of terms that he finds in the work of Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenologist, whose classes he took in Lyon, or the terminology of Jean-Paul Sartre, who became an important ally of his, but with whom he had this very productive, creative, and at times contentious relationship as a writer. Now, to go from that to the introduction, the famous preface by Sartre in The Wretched of the Earth. Well, Sartre appeared not to have read beyond the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, the classic and controversial essay on violence, which is very much a defense of armed struggle and a kind of psychological diagnosis of what happens to the colonized when the colonized finally rises up, but which also contains warnings about certain usages of violence. It contains warnings about the dangers of what he calls the primitive Manichaeanism of colonialism. For example, Fanon writes that it's entirely understandable that an oppressed and subjugated colonized person would, in the early stages of an anti-colonial revolt, regard any member of the settler community as an enemy, following this primitive Manichaeanism that has been imposed by colonialism, which divides the world into the privileged settler and the oppressed native. But at a certain point, an anti-colonial struggle has to transcend this primitive Manichaeanism, transcend the politics of hatred and revenge, and see that actually there are people in the colonial community who can be won over to the cause. And he had seen this himself, of course, because, as I mentioned, some of the people who had recruited him were, in fact, were Europeans who had sided with the FLN. So the Sartre essay is this ecstatic celebration of violence, where he writes that for the colonized, to kill a European is to kill two birds with one stone. the man, the oppressor, and the man he oppresses. And that the colonized then emerges a new man, better than the European that he was facing. I use these terms, the masculine terms, because this is the language of Sartre, and unfortunately also the language of Fanon. Now, Fanon never writes anything like that. He never writes that anti-colonial struggle is a collective delirium, a violent, murderous madness. Sartre, I think, was trying to kind of out Fanon. I mean, I think that there was a kind of competition for Sartre as to who could be more radical in his defense of anti-colonial violence. And it's interesting that Fanon never said anything about Sartre's preface. He had solicited the preface. He solicited it early, I mean, in 1961, and then asked Sartre again when he met him in Rome, when he met Sartre and Beauvoir and Claude Lanzmann in Rome. But he maintained a somewhat enigmatic silence about his views of the preface. Now, what ends up happening is that in France, a lot of people just read the preface. Now, by the way, I should say the preface is a brilliant piece of writing. It's a very troubling piece of writing, but it also contains some remarkable phrases. Sartre was someone who he was one of the only European thinkers of his time who really understood the historicity, who understood the kind of the radicality of anti-colonial struggles, who actually allowed these struggles to reshape the way that he thought about politics. And his book, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, is deeply informed by his understanding of the decolonization struggles. And in turn, Fanon's Wretched of the Earth is in some ways a response to Sartre's tome. So I don't want to take away from Sartre and just dismiss him as someone who was trying to insinuate himself into someone else's struggles. There is a legitimacy to that text, but it certainly goes beyond anything that Fanon said about violence in his introduction. And to that extent, I think it did not always do Fanon a service. And it also said nothing about that famous last chapter, Colonial Wars and Mental Disorders, in which Fanon addresses the scars of violence and anti-colonial warfare.
Thank you for that. I think we should wrap up soon. One place we might end is on the question of his dream worlds and his romance. I think you touched on sort of certain romantic conceptions he held about the Algerian struggle. At the very end of the book, in an epilogue, you sort of flip that and talk about our dream world of Fanon, the different uses that we as contemporary readers of him, people who are trying to navigate various political situations, especially have of Fanon. A favorite example of this is your citation of the first season of White Lotus, where Fanon is being read poolside, right? This is sort of the icon Fanon.
She becomes kind of a rebel herself.
Totally.
Although it's the indigenous guy who ends up suffering, but that's a whole other.
That's true. Yeah, very intentional sort of mirror there. But yeah, I'm curious if you could say a little bit about our uses and misuses of Fanon. That's a very simplistic way of putting it, but I think especially with the series of Black Lives Matter movements we've had since 2013, 14, 15, and leading up into the present, more people have been reading him. We've been thinking through what he means for us in our society. Obviously, now with the war on Gaza, we're thinking about him a lot. So what are our kind of romantic notions? What do we get wrong? What should we be careful about when we think about Fanon?
Well, I mean, I'm delighted by the resurgence of interest in Fanon's work. I think it's a great thing. I think it's wonderful that people are, returning to this work, which reminds us of the importance of the unconscious in our politics. And that's true not just for people who are rebelling against systems of domination, although it is. It's also true for people who are trying to uphold systems of domination. I think that Fanon is someone who could potentially help us to understand, the persistent power of white supremacy, or the attachment, for that matter, of people who are not themselves particularly wealthy, who don't have political power, but who still attach themselves to movements like Trumpism. I think Fanon is a probably a good guide to that as well. I think Fanon certainly helps us to understand, things like, the events of October 7, the attack of October 7. I mean, whether or not Fanon would have endorsed, the slaughter that took place at the rave, or some of the
against civilians, yeah.
happened. I mean, I think there's no question that Fanon understood that acts of anti-colonial violence do not occur in a vacuum. I mean, he always emphasized that the colonial world itself is the creation of violence. French Algeria was a product of violence. It was a product of massacres. It was a product of enfumade. And then I think Fanon also underscored the importance of the body. The impact that racism has on the way people who have been racialized experience their world, and that's a central insight, I think, for Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter protesters would often cite Fanon in demonstrations. I think one of the slogans, or one of the quotes that you would see on banners at Black Lives Matter demonstrations was that people revolt when they can no longer breathe. And it's a line that I think is a kind of eerie echo of what Eric Garner said, what George Floyd said. So I think that Fanon's ideas very much continue to resonate, and they also I think are important to people in visual arts and culture and music. There's kind of no end to Fanon's traces. I do think that in one very important respect, Fanon's ideas diverge from ideas that have become quite dominant in parts of the left today, and maybe we should learn from them. Fanon was someone who brought out very vividly the effect that systems of domination have on our lives, on our unconscious. But he remained, despite that, a fervent optimist. He actually believed that because people had created these systems could be unmade by human agency. He believed that we could overcome not just colonialism, not just racism, but race itself. I mean, he not simply by an act of will, but by political struggle, solidarity, etc. And I think that to some extent that belief has been lost, maybe been forgotten. I think that the use of Fanon in the writings of Afro-pessimism is quite striking, because it emphasizes the bleakest passages in Fanon at the expense of the last chapter of Black Skin, White Mask, or the last chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, in which he imagines this new world, and in which he says, no, in spite of everything that's happened to people who have been colonized, racialized, and oppressed, we actually can forge a new path. And Fanon really believed that. I don't think he would have involved himself as a psychiatrist or as a militant if he hadn't had that belief. He was not a fatalist. And it's understandable that we've lost that belief because of the setbacks that anti-racist movements and movements of the left have suffered in the last several decades. And it's very rich, I think, to tell a person who's been oppressed, you know what, don't worry so much about your identity. We'll overcome it, when we, forge a socialist revolution, wait right now, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and I don't think it's that any person such as myself should make that argument, and I don't. But Fanon believed this was possible, and I think that it's important to pay attention to those arguments as well. This idea that it is possible to create this new world. He believed it, and he got this optimism, I think, to a large extent from Aimé Césaire, from a man who was not his teacher, but who was very much his mentor. And Fanon continued to underline that point in his writing. It's there in Wretched of the Earth. It's there in that last chapter, which is his final message to the world. And it's something that I find quite inspiring.
Thank you so much, Adam. And it's wonderful to leave off on that note of our sort of Martinican inheritance of hope. So thank you again. Congratulations on this incredible book. I hope everybody gets a copy. It's just such a lovely journey. And thank you to Haymarket for organizing this. Thank you to everyone in the audience for spending your evening with us.
Thank you so much, Tammy, and thank you, Haymarket. Really appreciate it.
Bye.